All right, let's jump in and do it. I'm going to head into our file. Before we jump in and show you all the variant goodness, we just want to talk briefly about what a variant is. And the simplest way to describe that really is that historically you've had a bunch of different components that you've been managing within your design files, and that can quickly get out of hand when you're consuming them in the assets panel. You can get to a situation where you're trying to search for a button, for example, in the assets panel, and you are surfaced with all of these other buttons coming up. Variants allows you to consolidate all of that into one single property and component. Best way for me to show you this is with an example. So I have this button here, which lives in, you can see our friends of Figma pinging off in the corner. We've got a variance set in here, and I have my components inside, and I have my default button set up. You'll notice over on the left-hand side that the layers panel is slightly different. We have all of our different components from before nested inside this main component here. We call this a component set. This button over here then can be switched. Rather than using the instance swapper over here, we can use our panel on the right-hand side. So I can change that state just using this menu over there. Secondly, we have our alignment to code. So if I zoom in a little bit on here, you'll see that traditionally when you're building out your coded components, you have a situation where you have your properties, and your properties can map to different values. So this value here, we've got primary, which maps into my variant set over here for my primary button. My size maps down the bottom, and my focus state too. And then I also have this option over here, which is disabled and has an icon. So it really consolidates that experience, consolidates that consumption. Anthony, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I mean, I think that that's a great point. You know, one of the big things that's obviously difficult for us to interpret is exactly what type of code, what type of abstraction layers, what type of systems you might be using in your development environment, right? So for us to make big sweeping assumptions about the actual internal structures of things can be a little bit trickier. And what this provides you is with that layer that we know is translatable to anyone who's building components at any different layer. So however you choose to interpret those properties and values from your development side, you're going to have access to that kind of stuff directly within Figma, so you can actually communicate better with your team. Again, having that shared language with your development team, this is how we work faster together. We're all building the same product, right? So this is going to really make that a lot easier by understanding and getting closer to your components. That being said, you know, obviously there's going to be some difference for how designers are thinking about things and how developers are working at it, but this is going to give us some of that shared language together. So.
Absolutely. Amazing summary. Thanks, Anthony. Right, with that in mind, let's jump in and start building some stuff. Firstly, I'm going to go ahead and create a tab bar variant component. What I have in my file already is just a few icons, and I want to create a tab bar that I'm going to use inside my app. So the first thing to do is to create my tab bar background. And I know that my iPhone is set up at 375 wide, so I'm going to set that in here. I'm going to make this 80 high. What I want to do here is also just give it a nice black background. And then we've got our background set up nicely. After here, I want to make some tabs. So let's make 3 tabs. I know that this needs to be a third of the width. So 375 divided by 3. And I'm going to make this 80 high too. And this is going to contain my Figma icon like so.
You didn't want to do 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, 3 repeating percentage?
Yeah, absolutely. Just going to make sure that's centered. Then I'm going to duplicate this a few times and swap out that icon using the instance swapper to my play icon. And then lastly, make my search as well. Oh, the search is the middle one. And I'm going to rename this tab slash, let's say home, tab slash search, and tab slash play. Then I'm going to turn these into some components at the top. Just drag these out of the way like so. And then I'm going to pull these into my tab bar. I want to center this one, pull this one over to the right. And this is going to be my tab bar for my home. So tab bar slash home. And then I want to make
comments coming in just around the math and the thing. I don't think a lot of people knew that you could do that you're actually just doing math.
Awesome.
Over in the width panel, right? That was up in the properties panel over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
I'm just going to duplicate this because I need to make my search version 2. So what I want to have is a state where I have my home button active, the other one's inactive. I'm just going to select these, and make these 50%. So we have a home that is active, search that is active. I can then turn these into their own components. And then if I select these, what you're going to notice is that on the right-hand side, we have this combine as variants button appear. If I go and tap that, we get this new property on the outside, this purple dash border, which signifies that we have our variant set. If I then open this menu, you'll notice that we have those nested components on the inside. This outline here can also be styled if you want. You can hide that purple outline. You can give it a different color. You can change the thickness of the border if you want to. You can align this to your design system to make it fit in with what your design system looks like. We've seen some companies remove that border entirely. Some of them style it up a different way. It's entirely up to you. You're also going to notice that I probably forgot to add the third option. So to add that third option, I can click on my component set and tap this plus icon. That will then duplicate this top one and give me another option. I'll come back to the naming in a moment. So this one is variant 3 at the moment, and I know that I want to have this one inactive and this one. Oops, this one is active. So just click on my tab bar again and check out the properties panel. We'll notice that we just have property 1, which is not super useful. I know that this is going to be my menu, and I can flick that out when I want to use it on the front end. So I'm going to rename this as menu. And this last one that's popped up, this variant 3, is my play. So I can double click on that and type in play. If I want to as well, I can reorder these by clicking and dragging them like so. And that just gives you a bit more control about the consumption experience of your variant set. So I have my tab bar set up. I can Alt and drag that out to create a copy and use that like so by going over to the properties panel again, dropping that drop down and flicking between the different states of my menu. We now see on the right-hand side, I've got this little waiting for tab bar set up. I can click and drag, drop that in there, and we've got our tab bar ready to go. This is really cool, but we can actually take this to another level as well by having something what we call a Boolean value. So maybe in one part of my app, I have a situation where I've got a tab which is either on or off with a border. I can do that too. So if I select my tabs, I'm going to create a copy of these. I'm just going to break these up now and rename them so they have a border property. So I'm going to group them together like so. Command R on my keyboard to rename them. I'm going to select current name / border. I then want these ones to be without a border, so I can rename these current name / no border. And then I need to create a border. So let's just create a rectangle in here. I'm going to make it 4 pixels high and 125 for the width. Anchor it to the bottom and give it this lovely red color. I want to rename that as my border, copy that and paste it into my other ones too. I'm going to turn these into a component at the top. And then we have a situation now where we have these states set up. I can drag a box over these and combine them as a variant as well. And we get double properties now. So the first one is my tab. Second one is my border property. I can then duplicate this like so and flick that border on or off, which is great, but we should probably have that as a bit more sophisticated. And maybe we can do something like a toggle. So if I select my variant like so, and just change this to either true, yes, or so I've got true in here and false in here. And then on my tab here, we get this little switch. So I can turn that on or off. Anthony, there's 3 ways that we can use this, isn't there? What's the other 2?
Yeah, so you've got true, false, yes, no, and on, off. So some pretty standard Booleans that you might have. This is useful because not everything that you're going to have is necessarily going to be the actual like programmable true, false. So you've got a few other options that you can add in, and sometimes the word on might just make more sense than the word true for certain situations. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So then I could use that in the menu.
Good question. No, I don't know if 1 and 0 is supported today, but that's some good feedback.
1 and 2, yeah, that would be nice. So what you'll notice now is that in my variant set, I also have, if I select my component, I also have this border switch that I can ping on and off. And then in my instance, I can turn that border on or off like so. So I can flick between my tabs and I can flick between my border on or off. So a few very quick things that we can pull together to create quite a complex nested variant set within a variant set, and using our Boolean operations to take that to the next level. Anthony's now going to dive into something a little spicier with some multi-dimension migration. Over to you, Anthony.
Yeah, in fact, before we get there, I think there was a couple great questions that came in that might be good to just sort of do it while we're looking at this particular example.
Sure.
When you were clicking that the plus button there, that was duplicating the first variant that you had in the variant set. So that's kind of like the main variant that you're going to have. It's what's going to show up in the assets panel. It's what's going to be duplicated when you hit that button.
Yeah, it's worth noting at this point that we treat the top left variant as the primary one. So if I see this in the assets panel, if I search for tab, for example, you'll notice that this one surfaces because it's this top left, and then this one surfaces because it's the primary one as well. So that's a great way to think about organizing your components, is to think that the top left one or the top one is the one that we're going to be surfacing in your assets panel.
Awesome, very cool. Yeah, let's go ahead and move on to a little bit more complex example than what we've got here. We're gonna be building up over the section as we go today. So we haven't put everything all out at once. We're gonna try and add a few layers on so everybody can follow along as we go as well. So great, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here.
Awesome.
And just a quick confirmation that everyone can see my screen. Can you see the Figma window?
I'm just going to stop my share. If you can go ahead and try again.
All right. Try that again here. Can you guys?
Yes, we're in.
Screen? Awesome. Is it it's the Figma window, correct? Is that what you said?
Yep.
Awesome. Yep. Fantastic. All right, so let's build up a little bit from what we were just looking at, right? So the example that we just saw, we did a couple of really interesting things, right? So we started with having a property that we could turn on and off for this component. So where we're able to say, we want to switch between these different options, these different properties that we have, or sorry, different values of this one property. So this is what we would call something one-dimensional, right? There's a single row that we have, or in this case, a column that we have, and we're just switching between the states. Or sorry, between yeah, in this case, it's kind of like a state that we're working from. What we're going to do now is just take this a little bit further, because the reason why we actually spent so much time on this was, and why we call it variants and not just states, is because you can actually do things multi-dimensionally as well. So when this project originally started, of course, states was one of our big ideas, in the sense that we want to say, hey, what if we could have a way that you can have an object that has, maybe a hover state, an active state, default state, all of those types of things. But by going a step further than that, we can actually do properties in both directions now. So not only can we have something like a state, but we could also add a type. We could also add, an action. Is it destructive? Is it a warning, and that kind of things. And so by having states just be one of the types of variants that you can create, it really opens it up for doing a lot more fun stuff. So here we have an example, and this might look familiar to a lot of people, right? So this might be how you have your buttons actually set up today. You may have them all as separate components, all directly on a page like this, and you've got all of your different versions. Saw a couple of things come through in the chat earlier about the fact that we now can do radiuses on a single side. That I believe launched a while ago, but yeah, you've definitely got the ability to just do individual corner radiuses, which is awesome too. So cool. So how do we go from what we have here to a variant component that's going to be useful for us? Well, a couple of things can help make that experience easier. So we saw how we could build from scratch, but what happens when we want to actually use the existing components that we have? I could just go ahead, select all of these right now. You can see that because these are all main components, I can actually combine them together as variants, and I could just hit combine variants. In fact, let's do it real quick just to see what happens here. So we're going to get this, and yikes. Okay, that's a lot of different value names all under a single property. Not the end of the world. If I wanted to, I could go through and try and rename each one of those manually. I could go in, I could try to separate these out into different properties. I could try to add a new property because I know I want to have at least a couple of different properties that we're going to have here. In fact, if we look closely, we see there's actually quite a few properties, right? We see that we have a button that has no icon, a button with an icon, a secondary button with no icon. And then on top of that, we actually have columns for each of the states that we have as well. So again, this is what we mean by multidimensional. But how can we make this experience a little bit better? And for anyone who has checked out that preparing for variants file, some of the stuff that we're going to cover right now is actually covered in that document as well. So you've got some take home material. So if anything that I say here goes a little fast or is a little bit advanced, just know that you've got that as a document to help you as well. We're going to back up for a second. So instead of converting this immediately into a variant here, I can actually change the names of these components to make that experience a little bit better. And Figma will actually try to interpret and understand the naming conventions to automatically group the values into different properties for me. So you can see right now, if we look at these names, we're not using any forward slashes, which will put the components into different groups or subgroups. Here, we're just using dashes for everything. If we use those forward slashes, Figma is going to be able to understand how things should be grouped together. So for starters, let's go ahead and do some of that fancy renaming that Louis was just doing a second ago, right? So batch renaming is an incredibly powerful tool. If we select more than one layer, so if you just have one layer selected and you hit Command R, or if you just double click into the layer, it's going to let you rename that one layer in the layers panel. If you have multiple layers selected, in this case, I'm going to select all of these, and you hit Command R, this is where you get that batch renaming capability. So, and this is a very powerful tool. You can do a lot of very interesting things with this as far as matching existing things in the name, replacing those. As you saw Louis use, we actually have some, what we call smart variables in the sense that you can add the current name back into the file name. You can do things with numbers where you count upwards or down like this. You can sort of see what's happening over here on the left-hand side as I renumber those. And then one of the more advanced things is that we can actually use what are called regular expressions directly in here. We're going to save that for right now, but for anybody who's familiar with them, you can do some pretty advanced finding and replacing and moving things around. And I'll show that in a second. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's do a couple of things to make these components a little bit better as far as how we group them together. So for starters, let's replace those dashes with forward slashes. So I'm going to match our dashes as we go through this. Keep in mind that if you do a match like this, you're going to see here that if we say rename, we're just going to get that first match that it found. So it didn't actually do it for every single slash, and that's okay. It wouldn't take us too long to go through and do this for each one of those. Alternatively, you can actually search for all of the slashes if you want, using a little fancy trick here where we actually want to say, look for that. And then I believe we're going to want all. Okay, we'll have to come back to that one. But in this case, let's just go ahead and rename those exact slashes. Louis, I don't know if you remember what it is to grab all of the matches simultaneously.
I actually can't remember, but I think
okay,
you're on the right lines.
No worries. We'll come back to that one. In this case, if you're going through and you're doing this, it's just going to take a couple of things. So what you want to do is match the dash, add the slash, rename, and then you can match the dash, add the slash. And then we'll just do it once more for that third group as well. And there is a shortcut for this, so I apologize. I'll make sure to tweet it out afterwards as well as we go through it. Cool. So we've done a couple of things now. So you can see now from those dashes, we now have forward slashes for everything. This is probably something that a lot of people have seen. This is a common way to organize your component types. We were just starting from a pretty aggressive example where everything was a little bit different. So I could hit combine variants right now, and a couple of things are already going to be better for us. In fact, if we look and we say combine as variants, look at that. It automatically knew to take those forward slashes and create three properties based on those three groupings that we had automatically. But I'm going to take this a step further and say we can do even better than this as well. So look at property 3 here, right? Property 3 is that with icon, without icon. If I wanted to, before I converted this group, I actually could have renamed those as well. So if I come in here and I say, match everything that says without icon and replace that with false, say rename, and then we say match everything that's with icon and set to true. And now we say combine as variants. I now have that true false already set up for me. Now with a single property, it might have actually been faster to go and just rename these by double clicking on them. So you can actually just double click into these pills and rename them very quickly. But that false true can help a lot when you want to set up multiple Boolean values all at once. One other thing that we want to change here, and you can probably see what's happening, is we have property 1, property 2, and property 3. Why don't these have names? Why aren't these something that we know about? And the answer is because we didn't have that information ahead of time. We didn't know the names of those properties. We only had the values of those properties in the forward slashes. So now we want to go in and just make sure that we add these names back in. So we can say something like type. So type, in this case, we're saying type is something like primary button, secondary button, things like that. Again, I would talk with your development team, because if they have any specific language that they like to use for these properties, that can be, again, another just great place to share language between the two. Maybe instead of the word type, if they use something like, action or anything like that, there's different ways that you can go about that. And then let's go ahead. And this is where we're going to put our state one, right? So we've got default, disabled, focused, hover. And then finally, we're going to say icon, true, false for this. So we now have an awesome variant component that if I were to drag any one of these instances out, so that's another important thing to note, that if you want to, you can always grab an instance of your variants from any one of the ones that comes from the component set. So we have the component set here with all the variants in it. If you just option drag from any of these, you're actually going to get the variants already set for that component automatically like that. Alternatively, if you're using the assets panel, you can just go there, find the button that you want to use. In this case, I just want to make sure I'm on the right page because we're going to do a lot of examples today. You'll see here we have that button component now, and I can go in and I can set the properties that I want to automatically. And again, what's really cool is that when it's multidimensional, changing one property will leave the others untouched, assuming that there's values for the other ones as well. So you're going to be able to change between them very easily as well in that sense. One case to watch out for, and this can happen sometimes as you're going through it, is that if you ever find yourself in a position where you're missing values or you have duplicate values, the system's going to warn you about that too. So for example, if I were to take this one that says icon true and actually just change this to icon false, you'll notice here we actually get a warning that says, hey, there are properties and values of this variant that are conflicting. As in, if you went to go set that property icon false, there wouldn't be a way for Figma to know which of those two components you were actually talking about, right? So you'd actually have to, if you see these warnings, and definitely keep an eye out for them. We've gotten some great feedback too, just around like where we want to put this warning. Is it, so if you've got, if you're going through and you're working on it, please definitely, this is the time that we want to learn more about how everyone's using it and what's making the most sense here. So if you see that, you can go through and actually just change your values back. In fact, if I have that unselected, let's try that again real quick. False, and then I can come back here. If you select your component set, so if you don't know where your problem is, this one's really cool. So if I happen to have the right one selected, but if I didn't know where that problem was, you'll see that it actually says select conflicting variants. So you can come in, quickly select them and go, aha, okay, so these two have a conflict. I can come back in and I can say true for this. And now I have my awesome working multi-dimensional component. As you can see here, a ton of power with what we're doing as far as building on the stuff that we were showing a minute ago too. I am going to show one other quick example here, which is another interesting and quick way to build multi-dimensional components as well. So let's assume that you have a button that has a few different properties that you want to turn into a multi-dimensional. So we have got a primary button here. We want to quickly build a secondary button. What you could do is if you actually, so you'll see here that if we look at the naming convention, there's a couple of things going on. This is button, primary, and then I've actually already added the words false, false, and that's a little confusing, right? It's like false, 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 true, true, false. What's going on there? What's happening is that I've actually separated out values for both which one has an icon and which one has a menu icon on the end of it as well. If you do too many of these, it will be a little confusing, but the way that I've organized it now is I said the first option is the one on the left and the second option is the one on the right. So when I go to create this into a variant component, I can very quickly, if I were to actually have these as components, let's go ahead and just make sure that those are components there as well. Get the zoom window out of the way. There we go. Fantastic. create multiple components. So if you didn't know, you can create multiple components at once super fast with a selection, which is great. And if we say combine as variants, you'll see now I happen to know that this first one is going to be the icon, and that second one is going to be the menu that I have on there on the left. But again, getting a little bit ahead of myself, because what I really want to show is, let's assume what happens if you want to make another set of these, right? If you want to make a secondary button, you can go ahead, drag out. And this is true even for if you're not actually creating variants as well. If you just need to duplicate components very quickly, you can do this. I've created instances of these, right? I'm going to detach them because I want to create brand new components. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's change some of the properties about these. Let's go ahead and what I'm going to do is go back to the layers panel here. First, let's do a quick rename, right? Because this is still called button primary. So I'm going to do that fast regex thing again. I'm going to search for the word primary and just replace it with the word secondary. So immediately we actually just batch change that in those sets of components. Now let's actually change the way that it looks as well. And you can use a couple really cool tools for this. So you see we have selection colors. Selection colors is the way that you can quickly select all fills, strokes, text colors, anything like that at once and change them all at once. So what I'm going to do is I know I want this button to be a black outlined button. So I know I'm going to want the text and the icon and the menu item to be black. I can just go to selection colors and change white to black, and it did not care where that white was applied on, and it just changed it all at once for me automatically. Quick way to do that. Second thing we want to do is we want to change those fills, right? Well, right now we don't have access to the fill layer because we only have the top level of the buttons selected. So another really cool trick is that if you have multiple things selected in your layers panel, you can use Enter and Shift Enter to quickly move in and out of groups of layers. So if I hit Enter once, you'll see it immediately is selecting all of those inner containers that I wanted to grab, where I have a color turned on right here. I'm just going to break that connection, and I can turn off that fill if I want, and I'm going to add a stroke on the outside. So you can see how quickly I was able to create a secondary button there. Now, if I want to, I'm going to convert these to components again. I now have my variants. I've got the naming conventions the way that I want them. I've got everything set up the way that I want. Say combine as variants. I know this first property is type, again, as we just looked at a second ago. I know the second property is my icon. And the last one is this a menu? Does this have a menu option or not? If you wanted to have something that was a little bit more generalized, you might even say something like left icon and right icon. Because then we're gonna look at how you could swap out those instances as well. This is just a quicker example to show you right here. So now if we actually grab an instance of this, you'll see that we've got our button type. We can switch between our primary and secondary. We can turn on our icon. We can turn off our menu. Oh, so much power. I love it.
Anthony, just one more thing. Can you show the reordering of the properties in that part too?
Yeah, great question. So let's look at this example here. What happens if I wanted secondary for some reason to be before primary? You can actually reorder the order in which not only that these properties are listed, but also these values as well. So let's go ahead and do a quick reordering. So let's say if I wanted the icon to actually be first, go back to your component set. So select the component set. And then you'll see here that if I hover right in front of the name, I get a little tiny drag handle for the property, and I can actually reorder these right from here. So if I want icon at the top, and then followed by the type. And then if I want to go a step further and actually reorder values, I can grab primary and put that after secondary. It will be in kind of a left to right order as they go down. So you'll kind of have to keep track of that as you're going through it. But now if we select that component, you'll see icon comes first, and then it's followed by secondary, primary, which might be a weird way to order things, but hopefully helps in the example I'm showing you there. Awesome.
Awesome.
Very cool. So couple other really cool things that we can do here, just to look at. Two more pieces of variants that are going to be really valuable is how we can actually document these, right? So we've created some components here, and you may have seen some examples in both the documentation guides or the prepare for variants guides that we have, is that maybe we want to add some labels and understand what these components are and how they work. Some general best practices that we are sort of centering around is the idea that you can use labeling outside of your component to actually just sort of track these things. In fact, a lot of, if you go into the community and you check out some of the design systems, a lot of teams were actually already sort of circling around this concept already, in the sense that I happen to know that this dimension, right, is going to be the primary type of our button. And I happen to know that this dimension, this vertical dimension here, is the secondary. And then let's make sure we turn on auto list. And then if I want to, I can go down the other way as well, right? So I could say something like default. In this case, you might want to say something like no icon. Oh, thank you. Perfect. Or just default is fine here. Again, when you have mixed states where you're using different things to create the state, because we used Booleans, this isn't going to have a name value necessarily, right? So the true false, you could put like icon false here if you want. It's really going to depend on how much granularity you need to explain there in your design system. But then in this case, I can just say that this is like menu true. This could just be menu, and this could be icon, and this can be icon and menu, right? Again, how literal you want these to match up one-to-one to your properties is really going to depend on your team, and probably a design decision that you should make. I do find that having more readable names here probably makes a lot of sense. If somebody can interpret what that's supposed to mean and then go over and read the values, again, one of the advantages of having a system like this is that you're still working with your team, you're still collaborating, you're still talking with your team. So everyone should have an understanding of how the properties work. You're certainly going to want to play with them as well and make sure. But this is a great way to do some of that multidimensional work as well. We could also slice this another way if we wanted to, and we could actually say, put a second level of labeling out here, meaning that we know for a fact that these both contain icons. So let's put icon out here. And then we could actually say that we know that this is with menu and this is with menu, and we could say default menu and then no menu, something like this. For the Booleans, it's a little bit weird because it may not make as much sense if you're doing it like this, but you can kind of see how that multidimensional labeling can work as you go through it. I will put a quick mention out to if any plugin developers who are out there who think that they might come up with a cool way to actually automate this. That'd be awesome. Find me. Great. So the last piece that we want to look at here with these multidimensional ones is, or even just with variants in general, is there's one last piece we haven't talked about, which is the documentation of these in the inspect panel as well. I'm going to show one part of it, and then I'm going to let Louis talk about a bit about the properties as well and how that works. But first, let's look at descriptions, right? So if you're familiar with a component description, let's go ahead and just create a basic one real quick. Descriptions can be put on main components. So, I'm a description, or I'm a rectangle. There we go. That description is going to show up in a few different places, right? So if I go to the assets panel and I find that rectangle, I'm going to see that description as I hover over it. I can also, when I'm in the inspect panel here, and I select that rectangle, I'm actually going to see that that as a description here as well. Now, we have something that is going out very soon that's actually going to put those descriptions in a place where you're going to be able to see them even better, which is going to be up here next to the component name as well. So that's like normal descriptions, but what happens when you have a variant component, right? Where's the description going to go for that? Well, it turns out you can actually have double descriptions. Both your component set itself can have a description. So I'm the component set. And you may say, inside of it, you've got a variant, and the variant is going to have a description. In fact, you'll see the component set's description right above it as well, right there. So if I say, I'm a variant. And again, what you're going to be able to see in the inspect panel for this is both of those are going to show up in the inspect panel. Now, this is, again, the traditional way that we've had it before, where it's down here in the code. You are going to see this up here directly underneath the component name as well. That's going to be coming very, very soon. In fact, I think we're turning it on next week, so you'll see it there. It'll help out a lot too. Again, so why would you use this? Where would this have a lot of value? Well, if you're combining your components together, you probably want to still have some granularity on what they are and what they do, right? If you have a button that's, say, a destructive button, like something that's going to only be used for actions that are costly or dangerous or anything like that, you may want to communicate that, but that's not every single variant in the button. So you would put that description on your destructive button, and then your other buttons can have some other description or no description at all too. If they don't need additional context, don't feel you have to fill that in either. Awesome. Louis, I might pass it off to you if you want to talk about the properties panel.
Sure.
Great.
While y'all are passing it off to each other, there's been a whole bunch of questions in the chat around variants and prototyping. And I just wanted to address that one just because it keeps coming up. We are building interactivity into this. It's something that we launched or announced rather at our conference back in September. It is planned for January. And for anyone who's interested in that, I'm going to post a link, timestamped link to that part of the keynote for anyone who wants to kind of see how it works. So you can kind of see how it's going to work when we do ship it. So it is coming. We've heard the request, just a little bit longer. So thanks for everyone who asked that question. And I'll respond to all of your questions and paste the link in the Q&A for anyone who asked a question about that. So anyways, over to you, Louis.
Thanks, Tom. I also saw a lot of questions about seeing some rich examples from other companies. As you can imagine, with it being so new, that they're currently being developed, and we'll be sure to pull together a resource that lists a bunch of design systems using variants as well. Mm-hmm. As Anthony was mentioning, there is some updates to the inspect panel with regards to variants too. If I select my variant set and go to the inspect panel, it just treats it like a normal component as you would expect. So you have, as Anthony mentioned, your description and any other properties that are suitable for that one there. If I select my instance of that variant from the variant set, you notice we get these new properties in the top right corner. And these are our variant properties that your developers can come in and copy and then just paste those into their code tool as well. So we get those properties that we mentioned right at the start, matching to our component that we're creating in code that gets pulled together. I can't remember where we are in here, into this little list that your developers can use really nicely. Similarly, on your component as well, get the same approach that you would expect from any other component. We're listing out the development CSS properties they can come and copy from here as well. So you'll notice this is using Flex to align with the Flexbox model. Is there anything else you wanted to nudge on that one, Anthony?
No, I think that's a great example there. One maybe small note for developers, you'll notice that true false values are actually not strings. They're actual literals or actual values that we're going to have here. So again, a little bit more prep for how we are trying to make sure that this is easier to work with developers too. So it's the little thing.
Absolutely. There's just a few points on best practices that we'd just like to cover very quickly. I know, Anthony, you've got some strong opinions about this as well. For those that are thinking about scaling up their design systems and thinking what could possibly be a variant, what could not be a variant, just a few tips from us is to probably not set your icons up as a variant. It makes a lot of sense initially, but when we're thinking about scalability, performance, and consuming those icons, it doesn't make as much sense to use them as a variant property. If you have a situation where maybe you have an icon in a bunch of different sizes, that could be a variant in itself. But again, the consumption experience would be limited without the thumbnail preview that we can have in the assets panel for icons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I can speak a little bit more to this one example here. I might take over on screen share if that's all right.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. So just following that sort of train of thought in that example that we were just looking at, let's go back to that, make sure we've got some best practices stuff. Awesome. So here, what I'm getting at is that this may not be a great way to set it up. In fact, we're starting with the case that if you find yourself going down this road, I may suggest stop, sort of understand what you're doing, because there's some key things that can really help, and some sort of principles that I've been keeping in the back of my brain as I'm building things. If you find yourself beginning to build lots and lots and lots of variants, that might be a point to stop and say, okay, should this be a variant? Should this just be a component that I swap in and out? Or is there some sort of nested thing in here that should probably be unrelated to this component? So for example, if I was building a button like this and I all of a sudden found myself adding a version for every single icon, and let's say I've got hundreds of icons, all of a sudden my button now has hundreds of variants, which are the same as my icons, but now I've just put them inside my variants. It's sort of doubling up on work that we already have techniques on how we can handle that today, right? So if I was going to actually build this in what I would say would be a more sustainable way, what we could do is I'm going to take out these other icon buttons, and we know for a fact we just want to have two variants on the button. The button is just whether or not it has an icon, not which icon it is, right? So in this case, I'm going to actually name these back to, instead of icon star, I'm just going to call this icon true and this one icon false. Again, sort of what we saw in the earlier example. You can use variants alongside a lot of our existing techniques that we have. And that's a really important thing to remember. Not everything needs to be a variant. Not everything needs to be a massive variant. If you don't want to combine all of your buttons into some single massive button variant, that's okay, especially if your developers actually have them as separate components as well, right? There might be a point where one button is so different from another that they're not necessarily variations of each other, but they are actually different things. Another great example might be something like form fields, right? If you have select menus, input fields, all of those types of things, all inside one single thing, that could be harder to search for in the assets panel if you just find this one thing that's just called form fields, versus maybe breaking it out into smaller groups. Like maybe you take your multi-line text and your single line text, combine those into a component set. Maybe you take your different drop-down menus, combine those into a component set, and then maybe just have those all on a page called forms. You now have an asset panel that has a little bit more expressiveness and a little bit easier to use. And you didn't have to create that massive variant up front as well. Along with that, you can also continue to use nesting. So swapping nested instances is still a great way to compose more complex components and things like that, especially because it's all going to be preserved in overrides now. So there was a huge update to how we preserve overrides, which I am so thrilled about and I've been waiting for. You can now, if we grab a component like this, for example, as I mentioned, we're going to use these two concepts together. So we've got our icons that are not variant components, and we have our button that is a variant component. If I go to my assets panel now, and I want to actually look at these examples, I've got my button and I've got my, my icons here as well. One of the cool things that you can do directly from the assets panel is that if you hold down Option while you're dragging out from the library, you can replace components. But, so if I were to grab a component over here, and I hold down Option, it's going to swap out the component. I don't actually want that. I want to swap just the icon inside of it. So if you hold down Option and Command, you'll see that we can actually swap nested instances very quickly as well. So this is just a really quick way to swap. Oops, you got to make sure you have it. Make sure you actually get the selected. There we go. And you can actually swap those out very quickly. And again, because we're able to preserve overrides, if I switch this icon off, if I switched to a different button type as well. So in this case, if I was doing this on that earlier example that I had, because here, let's go ahead and just quickly make another version of this. We'll give this a fill. Maybe we'll change the stroke here too as well. Wonderful. You'll see here that, and again, I'm going to have to give this a name. We'll call this, add a new variant in here. So in this case, I'm going to go back to my component set and also just create another version of this. Awesome. And this is why we do office hours. We get to do things live. I love it. So you can see here now, those are all under icon. I don't want that. I want to add a new property here called type. And I'm going to have these two are type secondary, and these two are type primary. And then what I want to do is say that these two are icon true, and these two are icon false. And that's a quick way to actually quickly update all of your properties as well. You'll see now when I select the component set, it actually reduced and collapsed all of those duplicates and put them into the right groupings correctly too as well. But again, if I come back over here to my component and I select secondary, you can see that that replaced instance is still actually getting preserved. So that override is actually going to stay there as you change those things out. Same is true for if you override things like fills now too as well. There's a little bit of complexity with fills. You're going to have a structure internally that makes a little bit of sense for us to interpret what can actually be swapped out and what can be preserved. But now you can actually, there are ways that if you have things like icons and you want to swap those for other icons, we can preserve the fill layers. I did not set up that one correctly, so that is a bad example that must have happened when I copied it over. We'll be sure to share out an example of how that works expectedly. But if you do find yourself in that situation, there's a good chance that if I look at these components, they actually don't share the exact same structure. And I can see that here that I've got one's basically a nested union with a couple of shapes inside of it, and one's got a frame inside of it. So you want to make sure that there's a consistent structure to things that you want to actually preserve those properties for. And we're going to be doing some more announcements about all of that stuff too as well. So you're going to see some new updates and some tweets from the team around that. So.
Anthony, just want to flick to the emoji values one, and then I can close up with the community spotlight.
Yeah, definitely. Let's go ahead and I just wanted to show off a couple of fun things that we have here. You can do some pretty fun things too as well. I don't know if I'd recommend this for production, but we are in a time of exploration and we want to learn from everyone, and we want everyone to take what we've tried to show here today. So we've been trying out some fun things with the values panel here. So you can see here we're using emojis and glyphs in the panel to actually set values. Again, I do not recommend this for production because no developer is going to want to see a value that looks like that. So just keep in mind that if you are working with your development teams, these things are just sort of fun examples that we have. You can see here, but we've also got another great example with stars that Luis put together. So if you go ahead and you grab your stars, you can go ahead and use this for things like ratings. This one's a much better example and something that development team might actually find a lot of value in. I could also just as easily set these slider values to something that makes a bunch of sense, right? So instead of showing something silly like that, you might actually have these just as values of, 0, 20, 50, or 25, 50, 75. So whatever's going to make sense for how your team works together. But know that you can experiment with those things. And as you might already be familiar with, we are very strong proponents of using emojis in layer names and file names and things like that. You can communicate a lot of information in a very small amount of space. If you want to find examples where that might work for your team, I think that's a good thing to explore. Just keep in mind that for most developers, if that is going into code, it may not make the most sense for them. And using plain words is probably the best approach. So awesome.
Great. Okay, I'm going to share again. And just before we have a Q&A, just wanted to highlight a few things from the community that have already been shipped with the variants feature in mind. We've got Alexei's excellent material icons kit. Definitely go and check that out if you're using material icons in your designs. Really well put together and using our variants. Another one is Sergei's table UI design system. I know a lot of people struggle with tables and how to build them in design tools. This is another really useful resource. And this is going to be supercharged again once we release the next version of auto layout. Lastly, our boy Tom has done an excellent stickies file in the community. There's tons of excellent resources in here using really good nested components. And there's also a very fun part of that where he uses his own face about 10 times to highlight avatars. I'd definitely go and check it out if I was you. All right, so we've got, well, we have 4 minutes left of the hour, but we have plenty of time. Let's go ahead and have some questions. It'll be useful if the DAs could jump back in as well, and we can all say hello.
Yeah, awesome job, Louis. I think that was like, I learned so much on that, and I've been playing around with this feature for a while. So thank you for sharing everything. And also thanks everyone for asking so many questions. I've been collecting them over here, and we'll go through and ask a couple. So something that came up pretty often was really the kind of the practice around creating like a base or a structural component, and what you would recommend for kind of the new way of variants, if you'd be able to talk to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to speak to that one. And you, for anyone who's seen the best practice guide, we do touch on this a little bit in there too as well. I'll go ahead and share here. So we actually have an example set up here where we actually are using a base component. So again, this is getting back to that conversation around variants. Not everything needs to be a variant. You don't need to run off and convert your entire design system into variants. Variants is another tool in your tool belt that can work alongside a lot of the existing techniques that we have, like nesting instances, or creating, which a version of nesting instances is what we call base components or structure components, right? So these are the idea that if you have an underlying component, that these are all based on instances of that underlying component. Changes to the underlying component will affect all of the instances that are using that. In this case, our structure component actually has all of the pieces that are necessary to build any one of these variants. And then we are simply setting overrides inside the component set to actually adjust those as well. So what this gives us is the ability to actually make changes at scale. And again, a technique that you might already be using today in your design system. So when you go to create your variant components, just keep in mind that you don't actually need to include your base or your structure components as part of your variant. Another little technique that we're using is that we've got that period at the beginning of the component name, or you can also use an underscore. This will actually hide this from your design system when you go, or from your team library when you go to publish it. So you can actually have components that are basically just internal to the design system. They help you build out your design system, but they're not components that you expect people to use or actually go grab. So here is an example where we're using all three of these techniques at once, right? So we're nesting icons inside of our base component. And then our variations here are basically what we've done is that we've actually just turned off different parts of these this base component. So if you come in, select something like the disclosure caret, if I hit delete, it's just going to hide it because it's an instance. It won't actually remove it. And now we actually have something that looks a little bit different. So you can see here that that's a quick way to use base components. You can take this a step further too. If you wanted to, you can actually then have a base that's actually defined for an entire dimension. So let's say in this case, we know we've got our base component that both of these are based on. I could have gone a step further and said, okay, I want to customize a base that's just for this first set. And now I want to customize a base that's just for this first set. And it's this big cascade where this base controls these two, and then these two each individually control a dimension. This is doable. It's just, again, with very powerful tools, you just want to make sure that you're being diligent about it. As you do more and more nesting, we see this happen a lot in programming languages too, in particular, where we get really excited about something because we really want to do it, and we over nest things and we overdo it, and then before we know it, it is so complicated that not only is it difficult for somebody else to understand how to use it, but us 6 months from now, we try to come back to it and we don't know how to use it either, right? So there's a level of balance between being really clever and having something that's more verbose, but easier to use and come back to. And striking that balance, again, it's really a conversation with your team and understanding what's going to make sense as you're working through it as well.
Yeah, just to back up on that point, Anthony and I have spoken a lot about this, and we both agree that if you get to a situation where you do want to have these two buttons managed from two separate structure components, just think about whether that would deserve being split up into two variant sets. It makes sense because you've got these two contrasting opinions about how something should be structured. And that goes for all of your design work. So ultimately, it's a design decision in air quotes. And you as your team can make that call. Our best practice advice really would be to split things up when they start to diverge.
That's really helpful. Yeah, definitely like ways of working with your team will come in here. So I appreciate you explaining that, and I hope that answered the question. This is a quick one, but definitely an important one. If you would be able to talk about just kind of how you reset variants and which properties you can reset and how that function works.
Yeah. Lou, do you want to take that one? Or?
Got it open. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Great. Here we go. Awesome. So if you're working with your variant components and you go to grab a variant that's been set, because we have not, so resetting components is going to be, resetting variants is going to be a little bit different than resetting overrides. So you can still set overrides on these components. So I'm actually going to simplify, go back to a simpler example that we have that's not using nested instances for this. Let's go back to this example here. So you'll see here, if I grab an instance of this component, and let's say we go ahead and we actually just change something like the background color or anything like that, we have actually changed an override now, right? So we've actually adjusted an override. This would be much like if you changed an override on any component, whether that's a component set full of variants or just a single component. You're going to see here in this menu, so we've moved, the icon here has changed. It's now just a little ellipses for the menu. And you'll see here that we do get the reset overrides menu. So you are going to be able to reset fills, reset all, or whatever you've changed, you're going to see a list of those properties, or you can just reset them all at once. If you need to get back to the to a different variant, that's a little more interesting in the sense that we don't necessarily consider one variant an override of another variant. So in that case, switching back to them or back to a previous version, you can either adjust the properties individually, or you can always just go back to the assets panel and grab a new copy of your variant as well. That's a quick way to sort of get back to the original version of your variant. Otherwise, you'd just be setting it back like this as well. But again, they aren't necessarily considered overrides of each other. They're just different dimensions of the component as well. So, unless
it's a slightly different mental model.
Yeah.
Slightly different mental model for how you consuming components, but the resetting mindset is slightly different in this context.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, and again, you can continue to use overrides on your variants as well, right? That's a really important technique too as well. Not every override needs to be set up as a variant option. If you want to continue to use overrides as you're using them today, meaning that we know in some cases we're going to have a one-off color for a button, you don't need to add that as a variant. You can just go ahead and set the override, and now it's almost like you're working with a component as you would have before. So.
So I said one of my favorite features was the Boolean values and the ability to have a toggle in the variant. And we had a question, or actually a couple of questions, just regarding if we could see that maybe time and to cover exactly what the values were. I think it'd be helpful just to kind of make that clear, as it is really a pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely. Lou, do you want to take that, or should I?
Yeah, sure. Let me just swap over.
All right.
So let's go in here, and let's say we've got a situation where we want to have, let's just say, use that very simple border example again. So I'm going to create a frame, and I'm going to create a copy of this one and then stick a border in here at the bottom again. And let's say instead of this red, I'm going to make it a wonderful yellow. And I'm going to copy this. And let's just say I have it in here, but I'm going to switch it off just so we have to maintain that consistent structure. I'm going to rename these to be bordered thing. And then this one's going to have on, this one's going to have off. I then want to turn these into components, combine them as variants. And this, because we have our off and on automatically brought in, let's just say we want to change this to the status of that button or that bordered thing. Oops, and then select my component, drag that out, and we get our toggle in here. I can then come back and change that, whether I want that to be false and true. We get the same treatment as well. But I probably want true to be at the front, so I can just drag that to be like so, and then it's still reflected within our component down at the bottom, and how that works.
Yeah, and that will work for, again, true, false, yes, no, and on, off. And this is, you might see where we're heading with this, and some of the ideas that the team is thinking about is, how can this be even more expressive, right? What if there are other types of things than just Booleans that might make sense for doing this? There's certainly some great discussions going on with the team. I don't want to share too much just yet, but just know that that's an area that the team is certainly interested in, and how can we make those menus more interesting for a designer who goes to use that component, right? Because again, there's not a lot of complexity, but there's some complexity in doing this setup, right? You certainly have to be someone who knows how the components work, how they're organized, how they're structured, and you have to set up these things like values and properties. Keep in mind, when a designer goes to use that, they just have that wonderful, simple menu experience of these are the options that you can select from. So they don't necessarily need to have that same level of understanding or complexity to use the components.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst we're getting the next question, I'm just going to show there's these three options here. I would then set these up as having a right or left icon according to what I wanted to do, just like you'd do with the layer naming hiding that Anthony was showing before. Feel free to ask the next question, Joey. Go ahead.
Yeah, just really excited by this. Like, we have so much enthusiasm and so many questions. So we are going to stay on for about another 20 minutes or so. So feel free, if you do have more questions, to pop those in. It's awesome to see all of these come in. We just want to make sure it's useful to everyone. So this is a little bit broader of a question, but I would like to ask it just because I think it can be a kind of a big helpful takeaway. But really the question is, like, when and how should I decide to use variants? Like, what really is like the main characteristic of some of the elements that make me decide, you know what, I should go to variants for this? Or Anthony, as you're talking, maybe I should just, kind of keep these in components and use instance swapping. I think if we could just maybe touch on that mindset and that framework a little bit, it could be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say a few things, and so I try to keep a few key thoughts in mind as I'm going through this, and you'll actually find this in the best practice guide. It's actually on the first page, or sorry, on the second page of the best practice guide under using variants effectively. The three main things that I look for are there properties here that are going to be that I'm going to actually be able to take advantage of this, in the sense that they are actually related to each other. And again, that can be a very difficult thing to understand up front, but there are some concrete examples of this. Something like state. If you know it's the same component and it's passing between different states, that's a great example of when to use this. Another example would be, again, something like size. Size is another great example of where you may have the same thing at different sizes. So if you can construct a sentence as you're talking to yourself and say, this is the same as this, it's just that X property is different, this one thing is different, that's probably a good candidate for doing it. Another reason would be is the assets panel, right? So if you combine everything into a single variant, that one variant is going to appear in the assets panel, which is a huge benefit if your assets panel has been a bit cluttered from having all of your different variants in there as well. So if you look through your assets panel today, just go into your design system as it is today, go to your assets panel and say, what about this is the most cluttered piece to me, right? Like, I don't need to see this, this, and this. I just need to see this. That's a great example to say, oh, okay, so those are probably good candidates for variants. And then the final one is that, again, if you're working with a development team, talk with them, see how they've structured things. I mean, this is I oftentimes, I'll go in and I'll go, where do I put these components? Like, what is the folder for this? What do I want to name this thing? And all I have to do is ask the development team, like, well, how did you guys organize that? And then you can come back and be like, oh yeah, that's a great place to put that. And then again, more of that shared language with your development team. Yeah, I see that message in the chat there around BEM methodologies. You can use that as well too, right? So if you already talk with your development team, if you're not familiar with what BEM is, it's a naming convention for how you can structure classes in CSS, as well as components. It's sort of blown up to become a more generalized idea of naming. They may have some great tips and techniques on how you could identify what is actually a variant versus what is something that is uniquely different. And again, if you do it and you're not happy with it, you can certainly go in and change it too as well, or you can revert, or you can go back. Definitely play with it and try it out and experiment. I think that's probably a good thing. So.
Yeah, the way I look at it as well is when I've typically built out libraries, and if I have to group things with frames, I know they're a consistent set of objects, and they're usually related, but have a really minor difference in the properties. That would make a really good case for a variant. Things like menus, you can have a mobile menu and a desktop menu. That could be a variant. Things like forms, a really good case study. Tables, anything like a content row, they're all really good examples of very, very similar things that you typically find creating 10 versions of, finding the assets panel and thinking, oh, I don't know which one is appropriate for this use case. Set them up as a variant, and it should make that consumption experience really smooth.
That's awesome. Louis, Anthony, thanks for the answer. So we have a really good question that came in. Well, these are all really good questions, but we have an awesome question from Andrea, who shared that she's a product designer for an app. And as you'd imagine, she currently has separate component libraries for both the iOS and Android version of components. Mm-hmm. It's pretty challenging, of course, as you could also imagine, to kind of keep those in sync and up to date. And she's wondering if variants could be a way to get around this, or if we have any general best practices around that topic.
This is a tricky one.
Great question. Yeah. So what we didn't talk about were examples that you might want to avoid, right? Like if there are places where you may say that this might actually be more troubling or longer term maintenance than it should be. The one example, so the iOS and the Android one in particular. So like let's call that something like device specific variations. I think you probably want to ask yourself a few important questions, meaning like if they're in different libraries, there's probably a good reason for that to begin with, which is that you're only enabling certain libraries on certain files or with certain teams or certain projects, right? So if you combine those into one, you're now dealing with a library that's twice the size, and you might have actually reduced the discoverability of those other versions and those other variants as well, meaning that if you go down that route and you collapse them, you have to now choose which is going to be the primary one that shows up in the assets panel, which may not be the best experience if I work on the Android team and every time I go to look for my component, I'm seeing all of my iOS components first. You could mitigate this with a sticker sheet that you use, but again, that's a different workflow and might be challenging if that wasn't how your team was used to doing it already. So I would probably say that that's going to be a challenging example to try and do it for. Again, I don't want to say that, we're all designers and we're capable of making great design decisions ourselves too. So if it works for your team, certainly try it out, practice, and communicate with them. It is an example of one that I would avoid. And the same goes for things like, this is the big one, which I think is like colors and themes. It can be challenging and tricky to do it well. And a couple of just quick notes on that one, which is that variance seems like a fantastic use case for something like colors or something like themes or branding or anything like that. What you'll discover, and again, if you want to, please go and try it. It is possible to do it in the system. And if you've got a small enough system and it makes sense and it works for you, then that's fantastic. But what you'll discover is as you're building more and more components, you're now repeating those variants and they're uniquely separate between the component sets, but every single one of them is now maintaining those themes individually as well, meaning that when you go to create another component, you have to go and add all of those themes in. Or worse, when you go to add a new theme, you now have to go to every single one of your components and actually add those back in. Again, might be maintainable if you have a small enough system, but with a huge system, that's a lot of refactoring and a lot of work to add all of those back in. And this is starting to get into a realm where this is a great spot for discussion. And if anyone gets into Friends of Figma Slack, we're actually having this conversation here and there around what is it about themes and colors that's different than components, right? We have this concept called styles. There's clearly something unique there and something that we want to take advantage of. And are there ways that we can be doing that in the future? So that's the cutting edge of the frontier for our conversation. And definitely come join us in the Slack channel as we're talking about that kind of stuff as well. So.
Louis and Anthony, I've got another question for you, and it seems to keep coming up. And so I'd love to hear what you have to say. Essentially, if you update, you've got an existing team library and you update all of these components to be a component set now with variants. What's the process there? Like when you push that team library update, is it going to break all the connections? And can we talk about that a little bit?
Short answer is no. It will know that it's still referencing that original instance. So you shouldn't be too worried about having lots of broken components around your design libraries. The variant's smart enough to know that what you're referencing is still the original parent, and you should be fine and dandy.
Mm-hmm. So when you pull in when you go and you click the update all components button on your library file, your component, your instance, when you go and select it, you'll notice that it's now a variant component with all of the right properties already set on it automatically. It's amazing.
Just worth adding to that answer, just as an underscore. If you want that to happen, make sure you're combining the variants and not taking like one button and then creating new ones, because those will have no relationship to what used to be the separate components that are connected to those instances.
Awesome.
I've got one that just came in that I can ask real quick. I'm not sure if there's an answer to this yet or if we know, but just ask, is it possible to access variants yet with the plugin API?
Oh, great question. So there is a new push that just went out to the component, to the plugin APIs for support for variants. It was actually a necessary push that we had to push out there as well too. So you'll see that there's two new properties. I believe, I'm gonna get the names wrong here, but I believe one is component set, and you'll be able to basically access those properties as well. So this is both to prevent any regressions in the system, but also give you access to those new things as well. So
here's a question that I think about a lot, and I'm curious of both of your takes as well. The question was around, do you recommend setting the sizes of components as variants or having the user change it manually? Kind of an interesting use case.
Oh yeah. That's a good question. I guess the way that I would prescribe that would be, what is the intention of, who is making the call on what needs to change the size? So a good example might be something like iconography, right? Iconography generally has very specific sizes for very specific reasons, right? You're working with grids that are incredibly organized. You're working with base units that are probably multiples that work across all of your iconography sizes. You may even have your icons actually be changing properties about them, the way that they look. The complexity of the icon may adjust as the icon gets bigger. I think that's a great example of where the designer would define those sizes as variants. When you start getting into things that are more like, how big should this modal be? How long should this modal be if I'm adding more text, all of that kind of stuff. I think that's a great example of where you can use things like constraints and auto layout to allow them to have a bit of flexibility. And that's not necessarily something you have to build into the variants themselves. I will let anyone else on the team add to that too as well if they've got ideas.
Yeah, I was just thinking that the more we go down the rabbit hole of sort of customization on the front end of your design in the canvas, the further we get away from consistency, and the building process becomes harder to maintain. So if you do want to allow that flexibility within your components and your variants, just make sure you're documenting things appropriately alongside the components or in your design system, wherever you're documenting your components.
And real quick, Kevin had just asked if there was a way to hide properties in a variant. Let's say a component didn't need to select one or address one. Is there a way to do that now?
There isn't a way to hide them right now, but you can give them values that will cause them to adjust automatically, meaning that if you have a particular button that, let's say, does not have an icon, but all of the other ones do support that variation, you just create two variants that also, you don't even have to create a second variant for it. Basically, what will happen is that it will turn it off automatically for you. You won't be able to hide it, but you can have those properties adjust when another property changes and there isn't a relevant variant that's going to make sense for that as well too. So,
which actually puts the power kind of in the hands of the design systems manager, because if you're building out this consistent system across the team and you definitely don't want that icon to be on that button, it won't be. And it means that, as I said before, that consistency going out across the team is going to be maintained.
That is a great question, though, because the idea of having like almost like a faceted menu whereby selected your first property that you select impacts the options that you're handed next. It's a really cool concept, and you know, definitely something the team has looked at before. So.
Anthony, I was wondering if you would be able to, I know you addressed this in the best practices guide, but maybe if you were able to just speak really high level about why it might not be beneficial to use variants for all of your icons and instead kind of revert back to the old way. And I'm curious just to get your thoughts on there if it's okay.
Yeah, it comes down to a couple simple things. So I'm gonna go back to this example just because I have some icons that are right here. So if I could, if I wanted to, I could take all of these icons and I could convert, and let's just pretend that this is a smaller set, but represents hundreds of icons. I could combine all of these as variants right now. And I could say they have one property and the property is icon, right? It's which icon it is. And you can go ahead and you can grab it and I can switch between them. This is totally doable, but I find icons to be a very specific example where this kind of packaging up may not actually be the best way to use it in the way that people are using icons, because you'll notice a couple of things that we've actually lost here. One is that if I go to my assets panel now and I want to look for an icon, the only thing I'm going to find on this page is a single icon called icon. That's just not as useful as a searching mechanism. Imagine if I had tagged each of my icons individually with use cases or additional subsets of how I might want to search for them. A lot of that data isn't going to be accessible here. And so now I just have icon. The other big one is that we pushed a huge, awesome change to the instance swapping menu, so that you'll see here that if I wanted to actually swap out an instance of an icon, so I'm going to grab this, without variants, if I'm just swapping an additional icon, you'll see here I get awesome thumbnails of these. I can have these organized into different sets. So this is, there's just a couple practical approaches, reasons as to why I wouldn't want to do it. The third one being when swapping icons. Some people today really enjoy being able to just go to their assets panel. You can hit Option 2 to get there really fast, and then you can just search for your icon that you want to find. And then once you find it, you can just do that Command Option drag to swap things out. So that kind of process would change. Instead of doing that, you'd go to the icon here and you'd choose it from a list. Again, you wouldn't have thumbnails. So it's possibly just one use case where it's the traditional approach of nesting instances is a great example of using those in tandem together, right? So basically, instead, what I would do is I would basically get my component like this, and then I can swap out the instances that I need. If your icons are only a handful or very specific to the exact variant, then that might be a good example of why you would want to have it as a variant, right? Something like a drop-down caret. If I knew for a fact that I was only going to have a caret on the right-hand side and it was never going to be icons, I could see that being a valid use case to do it. But for the most part, I would keep them more expressive, because remember, you don't necessarily know every single place, or maybe it'd be good to explore every single place where your icons are getting used. What if the brand team needs them? Are they going to know how to use this? Or what if like how often are they getting updated? As Louis mentioned earlier, though, there is a good use case that might make sense, which is that if you have the same icon at multiple different sizes, or let's say, see, and these are locked at their particular size, which is good. So somebody was doing their homework when they created these. I'm just gonna hack this for a second so we can actually take a look at it. There we go. Cool. So like, let's assume I had two icons at different sizes. I could group these into a component set, and that might make actually a lot of sense, because now I'm still gonna have that one lock icon as an option in my in my assets panel. And when I go to select it, I'll be able to choose size and size from large or small or anything like that as well. Another example might be something like filled or outlined or anything that you might use it for. Those, you can combine those into smaller sets of variants, but that's generally my reasoning for not wanting to do that. So.
That's a really good example, like just sharing, like combining or creating variants from a single icon. That way you can still select it and select the size. I like that a lot. Speaking of, we kind of touched on overrides briefly, but if we could just address kind of text overrides and how that works or what to expect, I think that'd be helpful for a lot of folks.
I can jump in as well because I answered a few of these questions. And Anthony or Louis, if you have any more things that you want to demo or whatever, I know one of the biggest questions has been around preserving the text content when you're switching between variants. So when we turned on the feature, we had a very strict matching. That was basically the text within those text boxes must match. So for example, if they were both named and the text content said label in both of your primary and secondary buttons and you switched between them, it should maintain the text. But sometimes people are writing the label as primary and the label as secondary. And because that text doesn't match, the overrides were getting lost. We relaxed that rule and we shipped a hotfix late last night that basically says that the layers must have the same name, but they don't have to share the same content. So as long as they're both named label, but the content is whatever you want it to be, you should have no issues swapping between those and the text being preserved. Feel free to add anything onto that, Anthony or Louis, or Raji or Joey.
I think that's covered.
Cool. And also may also be worth just addressing this one head on. I know it came up a couple times with things like icon colors and stuff. There are some heuristics around how overrides get preserved when it comes to like overriding a nested icon within a variant that then gets like an icon replaced and the color sometimes gets lost. There is some work that the team is still doing on that one. It's a tricky one because sometimes slightly different rules apply and how we apply overrides is a little bit different in this case. So I won't go into all the details because it's like a really complicated thing to try to like articulate through words without a visual, but it's something that the team is definitely aware of and continuing to work on. So thanks for all the questions that came in about that.
I see a couple good ones coming up right now too, just to get to. So there's one question just around when you start combining things into component sets, naming conventions might start to look a little funny, especially if you've been using frame names and page names and things like that as well. A good example would be, and I'm just going to share here again, just so that we've got this. So if I have a new component that I've created, something like what used to be 3 components, and they were all living on a frame previously, there's a good chance now that I'm going to have a little bit of redundancy in my naming convention because maybe my single component now lives on a frame that's just called like, navbar or tab or something like that. So now I've got tab, and there's no other components that live in this frame along with it. So you've got a few options here. One is you can remove these frames entirely because you may not need them anymore. Alternatively, you could actually place it behind it. So if you still want to have some sort of visual separation, you can put a shape behind things. If you drag it out of the frame, you can drag, and if you hold down space, it basically is now living on top of it, and you can lock that back frame. Again, this is more of an advanced sort of cosmetic approach if you're creating something that you really just want to have a nice visual structure and style to it. Personally, I think it's fine to just not have them at all. I mean, you're going to see a lot of updates to some of the design systems in the community where those frames may not be needed for some of these situations anymore. You can still use them though, right? So let's say, for example, this may just have a new thing where I've actually just moved a few to the same page now because maybe I took all of my inputs that used to be on separate pages, I've combined them, simplified them, and now I just have a set of maybe 5 or 6 component sets. So I just want to put them in something called forms. I could go ahead and add that in as well. If you check out the best practice guide on the 3rd page on library organization, I talk about each of those examples individually. So when you would want to rename layers, frames, and pages as well too. So
it's also just worth re-saying that you can style that variant set too. So you could add that white background to the variant set too, remove the border if you want to, style it up according to your design system.
Yeah. There was another question I saw come in just around how did I do the descriptions on the components? So that is just using the component description field. So if we come back to, let's just grab one of our examples here. When you select a component, and remember, it has to be the main component. It can't be an instance. So if you select a main component, in this case, a variant, inside of our component set, you'll see that there's a description field immediately below that. So if you're setting the properties, you can do those here. Here's where you can add the description for that one variant. If you want to set a description for the entire component set, all you have to do is select the component set, and that description will be above the variants, as you can see up here on that. And again, both of those descriptions will show up when you're in the inspect panel. The component set description will also show up in the assets panel, but you won't see the variant ones since we don't show the variants over here. But if you go to the inspect panel, you'll be able to see both the component description and the variant description as well. So.
Okay, I think we've got 1 more minute, so let's just go with a last question before we wrap up.
And I've actually got one thing that I just want to make sure that I touch on, because I promised a few people that I would, which is I don't want to spend too much time on this because it is a bit of an anti-pattern and it's not something that I want to recommend, but I do just want to call it out because you may logically arrive at this idea. And I just want to say, hold off on it for right now. But what it is as you're going through and building your components, you're creating these multi-dimensions, right, for all your different variants and how you want to organize them. There is a shortcut that you could take where what you do is that instead of defining everything, you just define one example of the permutation, and you're constantly nesting them inside of each other as well. So for example, and I'm not going to build this out because I don't want that evidence to live out in the world, and I don't want to be quoted as doing this as an example. But let's say, instead of having all of these labels or buttons, I might say to myself, hey, wait a minute, these are all basically the same change right here. What if I just had one set that was just the state, and I want to pull out just the state, and then I have one set that's just the icon and the type. And so you end up with something that kind of looks like this, and you're like, cool, I don't actually need those. I know that those are going to be generated. And what you do is you nest these, you create this as a component set, and you do it, and then you're like, you create this as a component set, and you're like nesting them inside of each other, and you're like, oh, I'm saving so much time, this is so great, I'm not defining all of these permutations. I would definitely avoid this for a couple of different reasons. One is that it is going to be a headache to maintain nesting all of these properties inside of each other. Now, this is very different than something like nesting an icon or something that's completely different. I'm talking about taking all of the properties and trying to separate them out from the button one by one to try and like save yourself some time as a developer. Where this is going to be really challenging and really annoying is for anyone trying to use this component. They're going to have to double click each time they want to edit a new property inside of the next thing. The team is exploring ways that we might potentially look at this in the future, but there's a few other key downsides. Is one is going to be less flexible too. So all of your variations must share the exact same change, meaning that let's say your hover states are not just an increase in a particular hue or something like that, but they're actually very different, and you want to actually change to wildly different colors or anything like that. You're not going to have that same flexibility that you do with the permutations as well. So I would say, just for the meantime, while it might look enticing, and again, this is something very advanced, and probably a few designers may stumble across this as well. We are laying a lot of groundwork for maybe exploring these ideas in the future as well. But just keep in mind that for right now, it'll be a bit of a challenging experience. There's a note about this in the best practice guide too, in case you start to explore that as well. Again, I'm a huge fan of clever is not always better. So sometimes being a little bit more verbose, being able to see those permutations will make your life a lot easier in the long run, especially when you have to return to this work in 6 months and try to remember what you did. So just a quick note there, because to all those I promised that too. So
great. I think we're going to wrap it up there, everybody. Thank you so much for attending. Anthony, thank you so much for being my buddy on this stream. Joey, the questions were amazing. Tom, Roger, thank you for chipping in as well. Thank you from the design advocates. Thank you from Figma. And we'll see you all next time. We have another stream on Wednesday, November 11th. Make sure you come and check it out. Thanks for attending and have a good weekend.
thank you all so much.
One last little note before everyone drops off. For anyone who isn't in our Friends of Figma Slack channel, I know we didn't get to everyone's question. We'd love to continue the conversation there. I'm going to put a link in the chat for anyone who wants to join the community there. And again, thank you for attending today.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
See y'all soon.